After this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. The king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, who were confined in the prison, each had a dream. Both had a dream on the same night, and each dream its own meaning. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We had dreams," they said to him, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." This is the word of the Lord.
Knowledge is power. Maybe you've heard this phrase said, or maybe you've even said it yourself at times. The idea, I think, at least as it's currently used, is to emphasize the power of education or learning, and the idea that to be wise is to be powerful. And to an extent, in the right context, I think this can be true. But the reality is, I think we all know this, sometimes very stupid people can hold a lot of power, okay? It is not always true that those who are truly wise hold power, and it's definitely not true that just because someone holds power means they necessarily must be wise. But still, I think many of us find ourselves attracted to earthly ideas of wisdom and power. And we'll find this just in our assumptions. We often just assume that someone must be wise because they started a successful company, or maybe they hold a certain amount of wealth. We'll also grant power to people just because maybe they're a charismatic and convincing leader, and they tell us about all the problems they might be able to fix for us. And I think for many of us, at least I know for me, at the root of why we are attracted to wisdom and power is because at the end of the day, we think it will save us. Enough knowledge or enough power will fix all of our problems and make our lives at least a little bit more comfortable. And if you don't believe me, we can just look at American politics, right? They have learned how to exploit this well, but it's really a testament to many of us. Many will promise that they can fix this problem or that problem because of their wisdom and influence and power. And the sad thing is, because of our own idols of comfort and security, we're often quick to ascribe to an individual or maybe a party or maybe an ideology wisdom and power. And in doing this, I think we're failing to understand the truth about where true wisdom, power, and salvation come from. Today, we're spending time in the book of Genesis with the life of Joseph. And the portion of the story we're covering today will serve to remind us that wisdom, power, and salvation come from God alone. No matter what promises a politician might make, no matter what outcomes a financial guru might guarantee, no matter what wisdom a wealthy businessman might claim to have, ultimately, true wisdom, true power, and true salvation belong to God alone. And these things are most clearly revealed for us in the person of Jesus Christ. And that's what we'll see today in Genesis 40 and 41. So good morning again, church. I'm gonna tighten this a little bit because this thing wants to move on me. There we go. When Kevin preaches, it's raised like another 2 feet because he's so much taller than I am. So, so again, thank you guys for being here. It is always a joy to gather with the saints and remind ourselves of the good news of Jesus. And so, as you can see, and I think we've said like 5 times now, we're in Genesis. We're covering all of 40 and 41. And so when we cover these bigger portions of the text, I'm going to do a lot of summarizing for sake of time, but you are welcome to follow along. I'll try to reference the verses as I summarize them. And so Yeah, feel free to follow along. My plan for today is kind of work our way through the text by looking at three main truths, and then we're going to see how they all culminate in the work of Jesus. Let me do a quick review. If you've been with us, you'll remember that Joseph's story started in Genesis 37, where he was a young 17-year-old hated by his brothers, especially when he said, hey, I've got some dreams, and you're going to bow down to me one day, right? And that hatred of him eventually led to his being thrown into a pit and then sold off into slavery, where he ended up in Potiphar's house, who was an officer of King Pharaoh, okay? And in chapter 39, we read about his rise to power in Potiphar's house until he fled Potiphar's wife's advances. We read about that. And then he had his clothes stripped from him again, like happened with his brothers. And then he was thrown into another pit. This time it was a prison, okay? But 39 ended with telling us that even in prison, God was with Joseph, and he was moved into a position of authority over the prison house. And that is where our story picks up today. So you heard it read, but our story starts with us learning about a couple other officers of the king, a cupbearer and a baker who had offended. That's how the CSB says it. The literal word there is sinned against. This is a strong word. They had done something wrong against the king, and so they end up in prison with Joseph. And so they're there for some time, and one day Joseph notices that they look sad or distraught. This is a strong word. And so he asks, hey, what's going on? And they tell him, hey, last night, like on the same night, they both had different dreams and they have no idea what they meant. And so let's look at verse 8 again. They say, we had dreams, they said to him, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. And so this is where we find our first of three truths. The source of true wisdom is God alone. Joseph has made clear, and he will continue to make it clear, that true wisdom comes not from man, but from God alone. And so they tell Joseph their dreams. The cupbearer goes first. The cupbearer most likely was tasked with overseeing the preparation of the king's wine and drink. And so it makes sense that his dream was along those lines. Verses 9 through 11 tell about the dream. Basically, there's a vine with 3 branches. They blossom into these clusters of grapes. And the cupbearer in the dream is holding Pharaoh's cup that he had held many times before. And he takes the grapes and he squeezes into the cup some wine, and then he gives it to Pharaoh. In verses 12 through 13, Joseph tells him very confidently, hey, this means that in 3 days, the 3 branches means in 3 days that your head will be lifted up by Pharaoh, meaning symbolically his head would be lifted up and he would be restored to his position as a cupbearer. Whatever it was that he had done against Pharaoh, whatever the sin it was that he had committed, he would be shown mercy and he would be restored. And Joseph is so confident in this that he says, hey, when that happens, show me hesed, or faithful love. I want you to remember me when you are restored. And maybe you can tell them about how I've been unjustly placed in this prison. And he uses the word dungeon is how the CSB translates it. It's literally the word pit that was used when his brothers threw him in a pit. So this theme is continuing. And so the baker is standing there for this whole conversation. And in verse 16, we're told that he hears it was a positive interpretation. It is funny when most people give you a prophecy. I've yet to hear negative prophecies given like Joseph is about to give. So this cupbearer gets super excited. He's like, oh, he got a good report. Like, let's hear what mine's about. And so he shares his dream. The theme of 3 continues. Instead of 3 branches for him, it's 3 baskets that are on his head. And in the top one are all of these, this bread and these goods, baked goods that he had made for Pharaoh before. But instead of him giving that to Pharaoh, these birds of the sky come and start eating up the bread. And so in verses 18 through 19, Joseph tells him that meaning. So let's read that. In verse 18 of chapter 40, Joseph says, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days, so the same thing. In just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from off of you and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh from your body. I don't understand why Joseph had to word it this way. I don't know if it was for dramatic effect, because he's saying symbolically one guy's head will be lifted up and the other literally, Pharaoh will lift up your head as well, but from off of you, and he will be hanged. And so just as he had predicted, it all came true 3 days later. We're told that Pharaoh had a birthday, and probably there was a tradition to decide to maybe pardon one guilty criminal and then hang the other. And so this is what happens. And if you're paying attention, especially in the whole story arc, you're going to notice this theme of sin against a powerful king and mercy and judgment being shown. This language is pretty clear in the Hebrew. If this language of restoration for the cupbearer is language of salvation and deliverance. And later the prophets will pick up this idea of birds that will eat and prey on flesh from the sky, and it kind of symbols the judgment of God on a nation or an individual. And so Joseph stands here as the messenger of both mercy and judgment. And what he's showing us is that the source of true wisdom is from God alone. But even through all this, sadly, Joseph is forgotten. Verse 23 tells us that once the cupbearer is restored, he forgets about Joseph until 2 whole years later, when something prompted him to remember the wise one, Joseph. And it's another dream that prompts this by not these prisoners, but by Pharaoh. So that's how chapter 41 starts. Let's look at these dreams that Pharaoh has in chapter 41, verses 1 through 8. I'm going to read them for you. It says, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. The Nile was seen as the source of life, so this makes sense. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Remember, this is a dream, so anything can happen. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again, and he dreamed a second time. This time, 7 heads of grain, plump and good, or tov, we've seen that word in the text, came up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump full ones. Then Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. When morning came, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. So Pharaoh has 2 dreams. We've seen that pattern of 2. Joseph had had 2 dreams. There were 2 dreams, 1 cupbearer, 1 baker. And here Pharaoh has 2 dreams and can't find anyone to help him understand them. And then the story continues in verses 9 through 14 with the cupbearer remembering, hey, yeah, there was this guy in prison that interpreted my dream, and he tells Pharaoh about him. So Pharaoh calls for Joseph. He's brought up from the pit to Potiphar's house. And what happened earlier where he went from the pit to Potiphar's house to authority, and now here he stands before an even greater authority, the king Pharaoh himself. And so look at verse 15 and how this interaction goes. Pharaoh says to Joseph, hey, I've had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. I am not able to, Joseph answered Pharaoh. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Again, I think Joseph likes dramatic flair. Pharaoh asks for help and he's like, sorry, can't help you, but God can. So anyways, but Joseph really does want to make sure that Pharaoh and the entire royal court understands where true wisdom comes from God alone. It is not that Joseph is just any smarter or wiser than anyone else. It is that God, Yahweh, has seen fit to place Joseph in this position of understanding before what is most likely the most powerful man in the known world. And if he isn't right now, he will be very soon in the story. And so Pharaoh, think about this, the king Pharaoh, wise, he's in charge, powerful. He recounts his story, his dream, to this imprisoned Hebrew slave. And so in verses 25 through 32, Joseph tells the dreams again, Pharaoh tells the dreams, and then Joseph says, hey, what these dreams mean, they mean the same thing. So it's simply, there's gonna be 7 years of plenty and abundance and flourishing. Crops will be overflowing, everyone will have plenty, there will be more than enough for the people of the land. But following that, there will be 7 years of famine, which would have been long enough to wipe out a whole civilization. This would have been devastating news. And so this kind of good and flourishing theme versus bad and evil and wilderness, that theme kind of comes back up. And then through this, Joseph has an idea. He's unprompted, but he gives not only the interpretation of the dream, but some advice as well. He says, hey, you need to find someone who is wise and discerning, and because he's going to have a lot of power, and you need to place him in a position of authority. He needs to get people under him overseeing these years of abundance, and we're going to set aside a fifth of the food and store it to get us through the years of famine. And so watching all this go down, and watching the both humility and confidence of Joseph and his interpretation and wisdom, this would have been pretty shocking for Pharaoh and the court. You might imagine like a concession stand worker of a major sports team being brought up to the front office and giving advice about some blockbuster trade or, the starting lineup that night and in front of the coaches and the GM, right? Like this is how it would have felt for Pharaoh and the others to hear this Hebrew foreign prisoner spout all of this wisdom with both great confidence that, hey, this is what's happening, but incredible humility. Like this is God alone. Like he is the one who is doing this. And so shockingly enough, Pharaoh not only listens to the interpretation, but he also says, hey, that wise and discerning man, I like that idea, and who else is like you? And so he is moved to this position of power from the pit, from the prison, to a position of power, becoming the second in command over all of Egypt. And this is where we see our second main truth. The source of true power is God alone. If you read the text, it makes pretty clear through all of these things that Joseph is given incredible authority and power. He's got the signet ring and this gold chain. He's the robe that was stripped off from Joseph multiple times. Now he's got a kingly robe placed on him. He's given an Egyptian wife and freedom to travel over all the land and exercise his wisdom and ideas. He's not micromanaged in any way. There's full trust. But if you're following the story, even if you think that it is Pharaoh who is granting this power to Joseph, the truth is it is God alone. It is God who has been with Joseph this whole while. Time has flown for us, but it's been 13 years since he was first thrown into a pit. So through the prison years, through the lonely days and the sleepless nights, through the misunderstandings and the betrayals and the hurt, through the questions and the doubts, the one constant has been God's presence. And it is God, not Pharaoh, who has strategically placed Joseph in this role for a purpose and a mission. See, it does not matter what the world views as power. It does not matter what facades we like to put on and what masks we wear. At the end of the day, as Proverbs tells us, a king's heart is like channeled water in the Lord's hand. He directs it wherever he chooses. And we need to be reminded of this, especially in a culture that will ascribe more power than we should to earthly authorities. This is good news for us. Presidents will come and go. Policies will be added and removed. Executive orders will be signed in and then torn down in court. Decisions will be made, both good and bad. But there is one king who ultimately reigns and will have his will and way, and that is Yahweh alone. Don't let anybody tell you any different. We're told in verses 47 through 49 that everything happened just as Joseph had said. The land produced in abundance. Joseph stored up grain so much that he had to quit counting it. The verse 49 says there was so much it was like the sand of the sea. You might remember the last time that phrase was used was when Abraham was promised that he would be blessed to be a blessing and his descendants would be like the sands of the sea. And so we get kind of in the land of Egypt where Joseph was kidnapped and found himself in prison, who the original hearers of this would have known Egypt would eventually become a bad guy. That's how they would have known it. We get a snapshot of flourishing, a snapshot of Tov, of God's promises coming to fulfillment in a small scale. But remember, as we've said before in the life of Joseph, his wisdom and power was not for his good alone. There was a purpose behind it, to bring about the deliverance and salvation of many people and nations. And this is where we get our third and final truth. The source of true salvation is God alone. Joseph recognizes that he has been delivered and saved from the pit, not by his own doing, but by grace alone. We see this, I think, most clearly in the naming of his two kids. We're told in the story that during the years of plenty, he has two sons by his Egyptian wife, Manasseh and Ephraim. And again, this is a hint at God from the beginning, including outsiders in his story, because these become part of the tribes of Israel. Their names will come up again in the story, but look at verses 51 and 52 with me. We get the meaning of their names and why Joseph named him what he did. Genesis 41:51 says, Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh and said, God has made me forget all my hardship and my whole family. And the second son he named Ephraim and said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. He gives God, again, complete credit. A lot of ups and downs had happened. It had been, like I said, 13 years since he was first betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery. He's 30 years at this point. But he names his son Manasseh, and he says, because God made him forget his hardship and family. Now, that doesn't mean he forgot his family existed. We're going to see him interact with his family next week, right? And there's going to be eventually beautiful restoration there. But what it does mean is that any grief that he had experienced, any bitterness that might have accumulated, any revenge that he wanted to get, somehow by God's mercy alone, he had been released from. Because God had so cared for him that he trusted God with those situations. And I think it's beautiful because not only had God freed him from that, he also caused him to flourish in the land of his affliction. This could be one of my favorite lines in all of Genesis. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. This word fruitful should remind us of the first mandate to the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. Go be fruitful and multiply. Fill the whole earth with God's glory. Spread his goodness and beauty and tov. And then there was the fall and failure. But we saw that same thing with Noah, be fruitful, and then again with Abraham. And so here, through the life of Joseph, we get this micro fulfillment, a small snapshot of this place outside the promised land among foreigners with a foreign wife, reminding us that God shows up in the least likely places ever. And this is good news that I have been privileged to see not only in my own life, but the life of others around me, that God's flourishing can show up anywhere. It is not based on your earthly circumstances. And I'm not trying to diminish those. There's real suffering and lament and grief and pain in the world, but God can show up so big and his grace can be so real and tangible that we can say with Joseph, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. God has made me grateful in the face of those who betrayed me. God has made me peaceful when my life is falling apart around me. God has made me whole in the presence of chronic sickness. God has given me joy in the valley of the shadow of death. And when that happens, it's by grace alone. And this was Joseph's story. It was not that he was the smartest or he was looking to achieve this worldly power, but it was grace. And God used him to be a channel of deliverance for others as well. Joseph could say with anybody, I've been there. I get it. And God is still good. The rest of the chapter tells about how the famine came and Egypt was able to be this hub of provision, not only for those in Egypt, but also for the surrounding nations. God uses the most unlikely of people. Again, if the Hebrew people were reading the story years later, Egypt was a big bad guy in the story. But here, they're a part of being blessed to be a blessing, fulfilling the Abrahamic promise. God made Joseph fruitful so that he could multiply that to others around him. And truly, this story reminds us that the source of true wisdom, power, and salvation is God alone. But if the story stopped there, we might all just leave thinking we need to just be a little bit more like Joseph. We just need like some really good ideas, and maybe the ideas will strike some luck and we'll all make this world a better place together. But that's not the point. See, the wisdom, the power, and the salvation of Joseph, if you keep reading the story, was only temporary. And here's an irony. This whole situation that Joseph is being used to be a part of is used to amass all of the power in the world in Egypt. It will center in Egypt, amass for Pharaoh and his nation. And eventually Joseph will die and go off the scene, and all of that power would then be used against Joseph's own descendants, the Israelites. After his death, Joseph would be forgotten again, this time not for 2 years, but for forever. There's another Pharaoh who's gonna rise and forget that Joseph existed, and Egypt would turn from a hub of blessing to a hub of cursing and continue that pattern of humanity taking good gifts. Go, spread my glory, spread beauty and goodness, and instead we're spreading cursing through our own rebellion. Egypt would eventually become not the carrier of salvation, but of slavery and evil, to the point that God would have to bring salvation from Egypt, not through them. And Israel would eventually be no better. Read the prophets if you think they are. They would forget the God of Joseph. We're told they will become like all the other nations instead of being a light to them. See, we need a better Savior because Joseph is only a faint foreshadowing. Left to ourselves, all nations and all individuals, like Egypt, will take good gifts from God and use it to harm others because we have become so allured with worldly ways of wisdom and power. And in doing so, we have led ourselves to ruin. We have united ourselves to earthly ideologies and kingdoms and Babylons, and we have lived antithetical to the way of God's kingdom. Most of our lives and our nations look nothing like the Sermon on the Mount, if we're honest. Like the cupbearer and the baker in our story, we have sinned, but against a much greater king than Pharaoh, and judgment awaits us. The prophet Jeremiah explores this in Jeremiah chapter 9. He says, all the nations are uncircumcised in heart, even Israel. He specifically calls Israel out. And he says, because of this, you're gonna be like a scorched wilderness. He used the same language as we saw in Pharaoh's dream. And then he goes on to say that the only hope you have is not to boast in your wisdom or your strength or your wealth, but that the one who boasts, let him boast in this, that he knows and remembers the Lord, who not only shows hesed love, faithful love, everlasting love, but actually delights in giving that love. The prophet Zechariah prophesies as well, and he tells us of a king that is coming, but this king would not come in worldly ways of power and wisdom, like Pharaoh showed when he, paraded Joseph around in his second best chariot, so everyone would know you have to listen to him. No, this king would come not with the procession, but humble, riding on a donkey into Jerusalem on his way to die. But that through this humble life, Zechariah tells us, wars will cease and peace would be proclaimed to all nations. And it specifically says that this will happen through the shedding of the blood of the covenant. Zechariah says that prisoners will be released from waterless cisterns. Literally, the word is pits. Just as Joseph was thrown into a pit with no water, Jesus will come and release us as prisoners from the depths of our despair. Clearly, the life of Jesus is pointing us to the one and only King in whom true wisdom, power, and salvation is found, and that's Jesus. That's what this book is all about. With his life and his words, he constantly confronted worldly ways of power. He upended the political and religious norms that gave value to others based on how smart they were, how successful they were, how much power they held, maybe where they were born, their ethnicity, maybe their theological training, any other number of factors. And eventually this led him all the way before Pilate, where he confronted worldly power to its face shortly before his death. But he does it in humility and silence. He could have saved himself. He knew the right words to say. He was innocent, the truly innocent one. But he willingly allows himself to be hanged on a cross for you and me. And as I was reading through the Joseph story, I couldn't help but think about the men on the cross beside Jesus. You have the innocent Joseph who's found in prison with two guilty men. And as I said, it introduces this theme of judgment and mercy that would continue. One man is hanged and the other is saved. And Joseph is the messenger of both mercy and judgment. But if you read through the entirety of the scriptures, it's just like there's this tension because they never fully reconcile. And it's on the cross here. As the innocent one is nailed to the cross next to two guilty ones. And their lives stand as a testament of judgment and mercy finally meeting, or as the psalmist says, they kiss in the hanging body of Jesus. One man next to Jesus will be judged for his sin, and the other will find himself in paradise. But what we have to know, and what that story makes clear in the Gospels, is that the difference between the two men on the cross was not their crimes, but it was that one found salvation in the man hanging on the middle cross. As the preacher Alistair Begg has pointed out beautifully, you can go Google it if you've not seen like the 3-minute clip. It's powerful. You'll just cry your way through it. But he reminds us that if our answer for why we deserve salvation is answered at all in the first person, we've misunderstood the message of the gospel. It is not I did this, or I prayed some prayer, or I attended church enough, or I gave enough tithe, or I did A, B, C, and D. But rather, he did. Jesus did. It is answered in the third person. The thief on the cross simply asked to be remembered when Jesus came into his kingdom. Remember me, like Joseph, but unlike the cupbearer who forgot once he was restored, Jesus keeps his promises. There would be no forgetting of this man on the cross next to him when he ascended back to the Father's side after his resurrection. And Jesus was this man's only hope. He had no baptism, no doctrinal education. He didn't understand the doctrine of justification or the inerrancy of Scripture. He simply knew that the man on the middle cross said, I could come. And that was enough. Through his death, Jesus is offering salvation for all. He takes on our guilt and judgment, and he offers mercy for us in its place. He's the one who bears the cup of God's wrath and is hanged like the baker was in our story. And he bears the curse for us. As Galatians says, cursed is everyone that hangs on a tree. So he is the one who takes the cursing of our rebellion and the fall so that we might be restored like the cupbearer, full of mercy. Jesus is the truly innocent one, but he releases us from the prison of sin and shame through the shedding of his covenant blood. He willingly goes to the pit. But we know the story, hopefully. If not, let me remind you, on the third day, he rises from the grave. And he takes captives captive, and he frees them, and he shows the world where true wisdom and power and salvation are found. And yes, it doesn't look like anything the world wants to show us, but the affliction of the cross produced for Jesus the fruit of eternal life for all who trust and believe in him. He says he's only the first fruits. He's leading a procession behind him. All who say, you know what? I don't have anything to offer. I have no good apart from you, but I place all of my hope and all of my trust in the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. He will not fail you. He offers a life of flourishing in exchange for our wilderness of despair. And when we receive this, when we begin to trust in his work alone, true transformation begins to happen. We begin to finally see and actually understand and believe where true wisdom and power are found. That's why we don't feel at home in this world until it is fully redeemed and made new. We get glimpses of true wisdom, power, and salvation in the life of Joseph, but we see it most explicitly in Christ. And so now, as God's people, we now find our boast in absolutely nothing but Christ alone. That is all we have to offer. It is our only plea. I want to be clear if I've not been before. Our standing before God is not in any way tied to our church attendance, our giving statement, our income, our education level, our place of birth, our voting record, our political party, our theological acumen, or anything else but Christ alone. And church, that is why we are committed week in and week out to give you that. We can give you some good ideas and some great application. And yes, do you need to go wrestle in community, how to actually live this out and what this means, if this is really true, how our lives will be transformed by that. Yes, please go do that. But when we gather as the church, what you're getting and what we have decided to know nothing else among you but Christ and him crucified. That is it. Proclaim to you the hope of the good news. And so in close, right before we go to communion, I'm going to read for us from 1 Corinthians 1. And this is what I hope our message is over and over. 1 Corinthians 1:21 says, "For since in God's wisdom, the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of what is preached. For the Jews asked for signs," that's wisdom, they wanted powerful signs, "and the Greeks seek wisdom." Give me the good rhetoric, give me wisdom. "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles." That's not the way power and wisdom works. "Yet to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks," that's everyone, "Christ is the power of God." Christ is the wisdom of God, because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Brothers and sisters, you can hear Paul pleading, consider your calling. Not many were wise from a human perspective. Not many powerful, not many of noble birth. Instead, God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. And God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God has chosen what is insignificant and despised in the world, what is viewed as nothing, to bring to nothing what is viewed as something. Why? So that no one may boast in his presence. It is from him that you are in Christ Jesus, who became wisdom from God for us. He is our righteousness, our sanctification, our redemption, our salvation, in order that, as it is written, quoting Jeremiah, by the way, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, announcing the mystery of God to you, I did not come with brilliance of speech or wisdom. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified.